Okay, let's dive in. Picture this. Um, a world where the tiny engineers,
Hmm.
the hidden foundations of life on Earth are really struggling.
We're talking about insects.
Exactly. Insects, the pollinators, the decomposers, the base of so many food webs, they're just absolutely vital.
Hmm.
And the evidence seems to be mounting that, well, they're disappearing at an alarming rate.
It's a huge issue, really critical, and it affects ecosystems everywhere.
Yeah.
But figuring out why, that's incredibly complex.
Yeah, it's not just one simple cause, is it?
Not at all. It's more like a tangled web of factors all interacting with each other.
And that's exactly what we want to unpack today. We're going to try and cut through some of that complexity for you.
Give you a clearer picture.
Right, a clear picture of what scientists think are the main drivers behind this insect decline. And our guide for this is a major new study, a metasynthesis from researchers at Binghamton University.
That's the one. It's a really significant piece of work. They took a massive look at the recent scientific landscape.
How recent?
They reviewed over 175 papers, reviews, meta-analyses, perspectives, all published since 2017.
So, really current thinking.
Exactly. And their goal wasn't, to collect new field data. It was to synthesize what the scientific community has been hypothesizing about the causes.
Ah, so mapping the collective scientific thought process on this problem.
Precisely. They wanted to untangle all these proposed drivers, see how scientists think they connect,
And, crucially,
and, importantly, spot where the big gaps in our understanding still are. It's really about getting a handle on the whole system of decline.
okay. And for you listening, our mission here is to basically distill all this research into something clear, understandable, and hopefully pretty quick.
A snapshot of a complex issue.
Yeah. So let's start with how they even did that. How do you map such a complicated landscape of threats?
Well, the methodology, as you said, is this meta-synthesis. They focused on papers that were already trying to summarize knowledge, review papers and the like.
Looking for the connections scientists were already proposing. Makes sense.
Yes. And from these papers, they systematically pulled out what they called causal pathways.
Causal pathways, like a chain reaction.
Pretty much. Think of it as a proposed sequence. Factor A leads to factor B, and that then affects insects in some way.
Like a flow chart, sort of, for decline.
Exactly. Christopher Halsch, the lead author, gave a simple example. He said, for example, agriculture leads to pollution, which leads to insect population decline.
Okay, straightforward enough.
And they extracted thousands of these specific hypothesized links from all those papers.
Thousands, wow. And then they put it all together.
Right. They built this huge network structure out of all those pathways.
Mm-hmm.
This let them see visually, which factors were getting discussed the most.
And which ones were seen as the starting points.
Yes. Which ones were most often cited as the initial root causes.
And this wasn't a small network, I gather.
Well, not at all. It ended up with 108 different factors, drivers, things in the middle, outcomes for insects, and over 3,300 connections linking them.
That is a massive summary of recent scientific hypotheses.
It really is. It gives you this powerful, high-level view of where the conversation, the research focus has been lately.
So, looking at this huge map of connections, what emerged? What did they identify as the most frequently discussed root cause? The thing mentioned most often as a starting point.
Right. When they drilled down into factors proposed as the initial drivers, the very beginning of the chain, one thing really stood out.
Which was?
Agricultural intensification. It was clearly the most frequently cited root cause in the papers they reviewed.
Agricultural intensification.
Okay.
Why that one? What makes it such a dominant starting point in all these proposed pathways?
Well, the study highlights just how widespread and crucially interconnected its impacts are thought to be based on the literature.
Okay.
So it's strongly linked, first off, to massive land use change. Think clearing diverse natural habitats.
Forests, meadows.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And replacing them with huge areas of just one crop, monocultures.
So basically destroying where insects live and what they eat and replacing it with something much, much less useful for them.
Precisely. Habitat loss and degradation, right there. Then it's also heavily linked to pollution.
Pesticides.
Especially pesticides and insecticides, yeah. Chemicals often designed specifically to kill or harm insects. That link is pretty direct, as you'd expect.
Seems obvious almost.
It does, but the network showed other connections too. For instance, agricultural practices, particularly moving managed pollinators around, like honeybees.
Ah, for pollinating crops.
Right. Those practices are also hypothesized in the literature to be linked to the spread of pathogens, diseases among wild insect populations.
Oh, interesting. So agriculture isn't just one thing. It's seen as kicking off multiple negative pathways, changing the land, polluting it, and potentially spreading disease.
That's what the synthesis suggests is the dominant hypothesis in recent literature, yes. But it wasn't the only root cause mentioned, of course.
What else came up?
Climate change and urbanization were also identified as significant starting points for many pathways. They just weren't mentioned quite as frequently as agriculture in this set of papers.
Okay. And what were their main hypothesized connections?
Urbanization, well, that's also strongly linked to land use change. Cities expanding, building more roads, more concrete.
Leading directly to habitat being lost or broken up into little pieces.
Exactly. Habitat loss and fragmentation.
Hmm.
And climate change, based on these papers, is often thought to impact insects by degrading the quality of the habitat that's left.
How so?
Things like temperature shifts, making areas unsuitable, changing rainfall patterns, affecting plants insects rely on, that kind of thing.
Right. So it's really clear these big drivers, agriculture, climate change, urbanization, they're not working in isolation.
Absolutely not. And that was a really critical insight from the study. They found that these drivers are most often hypothesized to act together in combination.
Creating synergistic effects, like the whole is worse than the sum of its parts.
Exactly that. Over 80% of the mediating variables, the things in the middle of the network, they connected different categories of threats. It just shows how intertwined everything is thought to be.
So it's rarely just, say, pesticides or habitat loss in a vacuum. It's more likely the two interacting.
Or maybe climate change making the effects of pollution even worse for insects.
Right. It's the combination punches.
Precisely. And this idea of interconnectedness leads us to another really important concept they looked at, which is centrality.
Okay, so frequency is how often something is mentioned as a start. What's centrality then?
Centrality is about how important a factor is as a connection point, an intermediary hub within the network.
Ah, like a busy train station where lots of lines intersect.
That's a great analogy. It's about how many different causal pathways pass through that factor. It might not be the most frequent starting point, but it could be a critical junction.
The places where different threats converge or maybe amplify each other?
Yes, exactly. And the study found two factors that were particularly central in this network structure:
And they were.
habitat loss and pathogens.
Interesting. So even if agriculture is mentioned most often as the origin, habitat loss and pathogens are like major highways that lots of different negative impacts travel through.
That's precisely what the analysis suggests. Habitat loss often sits right in between those big land use drivers, like agriculture and urbanization,
Right.
and the actual impacts seen in insect populations. You change the land because of farming or building, that causes habitat loss, and that's what hits the insects hard.
Makes sense. And pathogens.
Similarly, pathogens were often seen connecting drivers like agriculture, maybe through those managed bees we mentioned,
Yeah.
or maybe non-native species introductions to effects further down the line.
Okay, I see how they act as crucial links in the chain.
And what's really fascinating is that other habitat-related issues also showed high centrality, often higher than you'd expect just based on how often they are mentioned.
Like what?
Things like habitat degradation, meaning the quality goes down, fragmentation, breaking it up, and habitat homogenization.
Homogenization.
Yeah.
Making everything look the same.
Yeah, basically reducing the variety in the landscape, like replacing a complex, messy hedgerow and meadow system with just, a neat lawn or a single crop field.
Or a diverse forest with a simple tree plantation.
Right. The study found this homogenization concept is hypothesized to be linked to almost everything: pollution, land use change, climate, agriculture.
Wow.
And it's expected to affect pretty much all insect outcomes. It seems like a really critical connecting point in theory.
Sounds incredibly important.
It does. But here's the kicker. Despite how central it appears in the network structure,
Yes.
habitat homogenization was only mentioned in 2 out of the 175 papers they reviewed.
Only 2. That's a massive disconnect, isn't it? Highly connected in theory, but barely discussed in the actual research they looked at.
It really suggests a potential blind spot, or maybe an area where research hasn't caught up yet. Understanding these central hubs, these highly connected stressors, it's crucial because tackling them might offer leverage points for conservation, get more bang for your buck.
Yeah. But it also means we need to be really careful about those complex interactions.
Exactly. It definitely underscores, though, that habitat issues, loss, degradation, fragmentation, homogenization, they remain absolutely fundamental threats.
Okay, so we've got the drivers, the connections, the central hubs. What about the endpoint? When research looks at the actual effects on insects, what do they tend to focus on?
Right. The study also analyzed the outcome variables, basically how are insects hypothesized to respond, what's being measured.
Yeah.
The overwhelming majority of the research attention, based on this synthesis, falls on outcomes at the individual level and the population level.
Okay. Like, is this specific pesticide killing this specific bee?
Yeah, or is it affecting its ability to reproduce, its general health, even its behavior like navigating or finding food? Those kinds of individual outcomes were heavily linked to pollution and pesticides in the literature.
So lots of focus on the immediate kind of direct impacts on single insects, especially from chemicals.
Yes, particularly agrochemicals.
Right.
And population outcomes are also commonly looked at.
Like, is a whole butterfly population shrinking?
Right. But the study noted that these population outcomes are often described quite generally, just, decline.
As opposed to more specific metrics.
Exactly. Less often specifying changes in actual abundance numbers or population density or geographic range shifts, more just general decline.
Okay, so individual and population effects get the most attention. What about the less studied outcomes? Were there gaps there too?
Oh, definitely. That was another crucial gap the study pinpointed, outcomes looking at the genetic level.
Like genetic diversity.
Yeah, genetic diversity, risks of inbreeding, things like that, and also impacts on whole community interactions.
How species interact with each other.
Right, like competition between species, predator-prey dynamics, how the whole food web structure might be changing. These areas receive significantly less attention.
Even for the big drivers like pollution and climate change.
Even for those, yes. There seems to be surprisingly little focus in this body of literature on how those well-studied drivers affect insect genetics or community dynamics.
That feels like a really big blind spot. I mean, if insects are so fundamental to ecosystems, understanding how their interactions and genetic health are changing seems incredibly important for the bigger picture.
It really does seem critical. And this leads us to, well, another major finding from the study. A pretty significant bias in which insects are being studied in the first place.
I think I can guess where this might be heading. Not all insects are created equal in the eyes of researchers.
Well, that's certainly what the study strongly suggests, based on the papers reviewed. Research is heavily concentrated on the popular ones, the visible ones, the economically important ones.
So let me guess. Bees and butterflies.
You got it. Bees, butterflies, moths, and also ground beetles seem to dominate the literature they looked at.
How dominant are we talking?
The numbers are pretty striking. So there are 26 recognized insect orders in the world, right?
Okay.
In this entire network, synthesizing 175 recent papers, only 7 of those 26 orders were directly linked to any hypotheses.
Wait, only 7? So 19 entire insect orders just aren't featuring much, if at all, in this recent research on insect decline.
That's what it looks like from the synthesis. Huge groups like Hemiptera, that's true bugs, aphids, cicadas, dipteraflies, mosquitoes, and Orthoptera grasshoppers, crickets. Despite their immense diversity and ecological roles, they received minimal attention compared to the big players.
Wow. That is a huge slice of the insect world potentially being overlooked.
And the bias gets even more pronounced when you look within the groups that are studied. This is where it gets really quite dramatic.
Okay.
Take the Hymenoptera, that's the order, including bees, wasps, ants, the genera Apis honeybees, and Bombus bumblebees.
Yeah, the famous ones.
Right. Together, they represent only about 0.2% of all described Hymenoptera species. Tiny fraction.
Okay.
Yet, hypotheses specifically about Apis and Bombus accounted for nearly 48% of all the taxon-specific hypotheses in the entire network they built.
Hold on. 48%. Nearly half the specific research focus is on just 0.2% of the species in that group. That statistic is genuinely shocking.
It is a stark figure. And it's similar with Lepidoptera butterflies and moths. Non-butterfly moths make up something like 93% or more of all Lepidoptera species.
The vast majority.
Yet they receive way less attention compared to the much smaller number of butterfly species.
So the science we have, at least based on this recent literature, isn't really reflecting the sheer diversity of insects or maybe even the diversity of the problem itself.
It seems not.
Why? Why is the bias so strong? Did the study speculate?
Yeah, they point to some likely reasons. Bees obviously are hugely important economically for crop pollination.
Well,
and bees and butterflies are, let's face it, charismatic. People connect with them, they care about them, they're noticeable.
so that drives funding and public interest.
It likely creates a kind of feedback loop. Funding agencies, researchers, the public, they prioritize these groups. That leads to more studies on them, so we accumulate more knowledge about them.
Which then reinforces their importance and priority for future research.
Exactly. It can become self-perpetuating.
But what's the downside? The conservation consequence.
Well, the big risk is that by focusing so intensely on bees and butterflies, we might be completely missing the conservation needs of the vast majority of other insect species.
They have different lives, different needs.
Totally different life histories. They live in different habitats. They're vulnerable to different things. What helps a bumblebee might do absolutely nothing for, say, a mayfly nymph in a stream, or a predatory fly larva in the soil, or a specific type of beetle living in dead wood.
And things that threaten those other groups might not affect bees as much.
Precisely. The study pointed out that threats most relevant to some less studied groups, like certain types of water pollution impacting aquatic insects, well, those threats themselves are often understudied in this context.
So economic importance, or how pretty an insect is, doesn't necessarily line up with which ones are most endangered or most critical for certain ecosystem functions.
That seems to be the concern, yeah. Understandable drivers for research focus, but maybe not the best guide for comprehensive conservation.
Okay, so we have these biases in what's studied. Did the study also find, like, completely missing areas, threats that just weren't really part of the conversation at all in these papers?
Yes, they did that too. They went a step further and compared the research landscape they'd mapped against external classifications, like the IUCN Red List threat categories.
To see if whole types of known threats were just absent.
Pretty much. And they found that while the big categories like agriculture, pollution, climate change, urbanization are studied, there are still significant gaps even within those.
Like gaps within the known threats,
Okay, take pollution. The research they reviewed focused heavily on agrochemicals, light pollution, and nutrient pollution, like excess fertilizers.
Right.
But other potential pollutants, things like noise pollution or many kinds of industrial or urban effluent that aren't directly agricultural, they received very little attention in the specific body of literature on insect decline.
So a narrow focus even within the broad recognized categories.
Seems so. But perhaps even more concerning, they found entire categories of threats, things known to impact biodiversity globally, that were almost completely missing from the insect decline literature they synthesized.
Really? What kinds of major threats were barely getting a mention?
Things categorized under human-caused disturbance.
Yeah.
That could be intense recreation, certain work activities impacting habitats.
Okay.
Also, geological events, volcanoes, earthquakes, although those are often more localized threats. And significantly, energy production and mining.
Energy production, like impacts from building wind farms or mining operations.
Exactly. The study points out that these categories, disturbance, geological events, energy production, mining, are listed as known threats by the IUCN for hundreds of vulnerable or endangered insect species.
Hundreds of species known to be threatened by these things.
Yet these threats hardly appeared at all in this extensive synthesis of recent research, specifically framed around insect decline.
That does sound like a potentially massive knowledge gap. Known threats to vulnerable species are just sort of off the radar in this specific research conversation.
It certainly looks that way based on their analysis. And just to reiterate, that other gap we talked about, studying genetic effects and community-level outcomes that persisted across almost all of the stressor categories, whether they were well-studied ones or the understudied ones.
Okay, so let's try and pull all of this together. We've mapped the drivers, the connections, the outcomes, the biases, the gaps. What does this huge synthesis study ultimately tell us about how we should approach tackling insect decline?
Well, I think it paints a really clear picture of a problem that is complex, deeply complex and multifaceted.
No silver bullets.
Definitely not. The threats are many, they're highly interconnected, and they often seem to work together synergistically. That strongly suggests that simple, single-solution conservation approaches, they're probably not going to cut it on their own.
Right. Like, just banning one specific pesticide won't solve the problem if we're still converting all the habitat to monocultures or the climate keeps changing rapidly.
Exactly. The study really underscores the need for research to get more detailed, more quantitative. We need to move beyond just general descriptions of decline and really try to understand the specific impacts and, crucially, the interactions of different drivers on different types of insects and at different levels, individual, population, genetic, community.
We absolutely cannot ignore that huge bias in what insects and which threats are getting studied?
No, that's a critical message. That concentration on a tiny fraction of species and a limited set of threats means we're almost certainly missing huge parts of the overall problem.
And potentially failing to address the conservation needs of the vast majority of insects out there.
That's the worry. So what's the takeaway for action? What do we do now? The study makes a strong point here. While we absolutely need more targeted research, especially for those underrepresented species, understudied threats, and also in underrepresented regions like the tropics and the southern hemisphere.
We don't have to wait for all that research to be done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We also know enough about the really fundamental drivers right now to act.
We don't need a perfect, complete map of every single interaction before we start trying to fix things.
Precisely. We know from this study and many others that things like habitat loss and degradation, climate change, and the pervasive use of harmful pesticides are major problems. They show up consistently.
So action is needed now.
Yes. Conservation efforts focused on protecting and restoring habitats, on mitigating climate change, and on seriously reducing harmful chemical use. Those need to proceed urgently. They should happen in parallel with the research that's busy refining our understanding of all the complex details.
Action and research have to go hand in hand, reinforce each other.
That's the message. We need both.
Okay, so this metasynthesis really gives us an invaluable, if slightly sobering, overview of the scientific conversation around insect decline. It highlights, the perceived dominance of agriculture, climate change, urbanization as root causes.
The crucial connecting role of habitat loss and pathogens.
And these alarming gaps, genetic effects, community impacts, and, maybe most critically, that huge bias in which insects and which threats are even getting consistent attention.
Yeah, it reveals a problem that's both incredibly complex and undeniably urgent. It shows us where the scientific spotlight has been shining.
And just as importantly, where it hasn't, the dark corners.
Exactly.
So thinking about this intricate, interconnected web of decline, affecting creatures that are so fundamental to life on Earth, what does it all mean? Given how deeply linked all these threats are and how essential insects are to, well, everything around us, what does this picture of their decline really reveal about the overall health of our planet? And maybe for you listening, what small part might you consider playing in addressing even just one thread in this incredibly complex